Welcome back to the class. We are almost halfway through our discussion on cultural globalization, and we completed 1 week of discussion and lectures on this very interesting aspect of cultural globalization. We discussed about the concept of culture. We discussed about McDonaldization. We discussed about clash of civilization thesis, and this week we are starting yet another series of very interesting discussions. And in this week, predominantly, we will be looking at an Indian anthropologist who has became extremely famous and prominent figure in the field of anthropology and sociology. And his name is Arjun Appadurai. So we will be spending maybe 3 or 4 hours or 3 or 4 sessions trying to understand Appadurai's arguments about cultural globalization, and then followed by another session on cosmopolitanism by Ulrich Beck. Ulrich Beck, we will meet him again later. We will take up his articles and works later down the line when we discuss about the risk society, when we discuss about the state, the changing role of state in the era of globalization. We will come across Ulrich Beck again. But Appadurai, we will not come across again. So we will spend sufficient time to get some broader understanding about the arguments of Appadurai, and it is also interesting and important for us that globalization literature, especially on cultural globalization, is greatly benefited by an Indian scholar, Indian anthropologist, and definitely he is one among the most well-known anthropologists of Indian origin. Maybe the most, we can very confidently say he is one of the most famous or popular anthropologists in the world, and it's great pride that he belongs to India. So in this session, I'll just have some brief introduction to Appadurai and his kind of work, his major works, and then we will start his very important essay. We'll discuss halfway through the extremely important essay. And then we will continue with that remaining part of the essay in the next class. So, an eminent Indian anthropologist whose theorization on cultural globalization became highly influential, and there are, it's very interesting that there are, as I mentioned, Appadurai is one of the very important, prominent voices in the field of cultural globalization, who looked at globalization from the perspective of anthropological research, and he's an eminently well-known, renowned person across the globe. And maybe we can also say that very confidently that he is one of the foremost theoreticians on cultural globalization. His name appears among the first scholars, among the scholars of the most initial period, who came up with very fascinating theories on globalization. So his intervention, and you will be surprised to see that is one of the most celebrated essays that we are going to discuss down, that is Disjuncture and Difference, okay, in the cultural economy of the globe. So this particular essay he first wrote in the year 1990, okay, in the very initial phases of globalization, and later it came out as a part of the book later in 1996. But his first essay, and that too, even now, this essay is a compulsory reading in any classes on globalization, sociology of globalization, or anthropology of globalization, or on cultural globalization. So he was able to write this essay almost 30 years back in the very initial nascent phases of globalization. Is a very, very important point. He was born and brought up in Mumbai, completed his PhD from University of Chicago, and his PhD thesis was on a car festival in this Triplicane temple, Parthasarathi temple in Triplicane in Chennai, and that was published as The Worship and Conflict Under Colonial Rule, a South Indian Case. And after that, he has served in many top US universities. I'm not listing out the names of the universities. He has been a visiting scholar to many universities, and he spent most of his career with the New York University. So Those who are interested can always look up information on Arjun Appadurai in the internet. There is a Wikipedia page on him, and there are a lot of information out there, a lot of YouTube lectures, and then his writings are, is a very prolific writer as well. So his theorization of globalization, that is the Disjuncture and Difference, published in 1990, became one of the seminal essays on cultural globalization. So we are going to spend at least 2 sessions, including this and the next session. We will discuss this essay in detail so that you understand what is the kind of uniqueness of Appadurai's take on cultural globalization. So he created a major disruption on the theorization of globalization. This particular quote is taken, this part of this textbook is taken from Andrew Jones' Globalization Key Thinkers, and this is one of the textbooks that I have prescribed for you. So as I mentioned, Andrew Jones introduces each thinker, provides an introduction to the scholar's intellectual career, intellectual contribution, and then discusses some of the substantive themes of this particular scholar, and ends each essay with a scholarly commentary or an evaluation. So he says that Andrew Jones says that Appadurai really disrupted the theorization on cultural globalization, and he was always on the margins. He was never in the mainstream of the theorization, and mainly because his kind of theorization that Appadurai put forward did not fit into any of the conventional modes or conventional forms of thinking. It always had its own independence. It always had its own existence. It was very difficult to surpass that, and it will become clearer when we read or discuss his arguments. It's an extremely complicated and overarching, it's just a very overbearing kind of a theorization. So Andrew Jones writes that, in short, much mainstream thinking about globalization lack any explicit engagement with cultural issues, or at least has done until recently. And Appadurai's work leads quickly to the conclusion that this is a significant problem. Okay, as we mentioned in the previous class, the cultural question were always on the periphery. They were always on the margins, and globalization was predominantly seen as an economic process. Globalization was seen as a political process, as something that significantly alters the political compositions of nation state. And what happens to culture or was seen only as a kind of a, as peripheral. It was only seen as a residual category. But scholars like Appadurai and a host of others do not agree with this particular argument. Ultimately, I will suggest Appadurai and other cultural thinkers about globalization lead us back to key epistemological issues about the nature of space, place, and the spatiality of social interconnectedness, and in so doing provides important insights into one of the key future directions that thinking about globalization needs to take. So this is a very fundamental question, fundamental argument that Andrew Jones argued that scholars like Appadurai and others, they provide as to a key epistemological issue about the nature of space. Okay, how do we make sense of space and time, space and place? Is there a distinction between place and space? Usually we use them interchangeably, but we know that in social sciences and in physics or even in geography, these two terms are very different. A place, you always attach a meaning of a given geographical area. It has a givenness, it has a concrete character, it has boundaries. Whereas space is something different. A space does not need to indicate a kind of a geographical, geographically bounded place. Okay, so there are very interesting theorization which we will discuss. And the spatiality of social interconnectedness, and this is again the central pivot around which sociological theorization on globalization take place. Okay, what is the spatiality of social interconnectedness? Sociology deals with social interconnectedness. Sociology looks at the web of a relationship. Social, or in other words, social interaction is the subject matter of sociological theorization. So in that scenario, what is happening to the spatiality question? How is different forms of spatiality comes into picture, and how that has significant influences on the questions of social interconnectedness, and this becomes the central concern of sociological theorization. So yeah, these are two important books. There are quite a lot of books, but I have only chosen some of the important ones. One is this Modernity at Large, Cultural Dimensions of Globalization, published in 1996. We will be following the essay, this Disjuncture and Difference, that appeared in this particular work. And this is a more longer version of this essay. He had published a much shorter and a concise version of the essay in different articles or in different places. But I am going by this this particular version that appeared in this book, Modernity at Large. I will also introduce you to this book. And he also brought out a very interesting work, The Fear of Small Numbers, an essay on the geography of anger, published in 2006, which I think we will again take up maybe for one session to see what is his arguments about the fear of small numbers. It's a very, very important work which really reflects a whole lot of dynamics that is happening around us. Why that the small numbers of people, he's using this small number basically to indicate the minorities. Why that minorities, whether it is religious minorities or ethnic minorities or refugees, why do these small numbers create so much of angst and apprehension and anxiety among the majority? Okay, it's a very, very fascinating question, and we will come back to that. So these are the this is the very introductory remarks about Appadurai, and now I will go to his book, that is Modernity at Large, and will introduce, and then we'll get started with his first essay. This is the title, or this is the book rather, Arjun Appadurai, Modernity at Large, Cultural Dimension of Globalization, published in 1996. It's University of Minnesota Press, and I will also show you the content. Yeah, so there's an acknowledgement section, and then there's part 1, global flows. Here and now it's the introduction. We are not going to discuss that, and we are discussing this particular essay, Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy. This is a 27 page long essay. We are not doing this essay completely because I felt that it might be too much for you. So I'll be discussing the central themes in that work, not this entire essay in toto, because he has published more shorter abridged version of this essay, and his central argument about what does it mean to be disjuncture and difference in the global cultural economy is what we are discussing. And he has the second part 2, numbers of playing modernity, the decolonization of Indian cricket. Then and then there is a 9th chapter, the production of locality. This is also we will discuss in slight detail, okay, because this is also something very important contribution by Appadurai. Very, very different kind of a discussion, very, very different kind of imagination, argument about what it means to be locality, what is the meaning of neighborhood, and how are say localities created in this globally interconnected world. Very, very important theorizations. So I would strongly urge you to get hold of these essays, if the book itself is possible, and to read them. It may not be very easy reading in the very beginning, but I'm sure that you will be able to make sense of it gradually. But ensure that you develop that habit of reading these original essays. They will be really helpful, though it might require some attempt from your side to make sense of them, but it's always worth doing that. So let us skip the introduction and come to the part 1, global flows, and his argument about disjuncture and difference in the global cultural economy. So this is the the essay that we are going to discuss. Okay, I have highlighted the important sections, so it will be helpful for you to note down where it is and why that these are important. So he begins this essay with a rather lengthy introduction about the larger changes happening about in terms of human cultural interaction and cultural interconnectedness in the historical sense. So he says it takes only the merest acquaintance with the facts of the modern world that to note that it is now an interactive system, in the sense that it is strikingly new. Historians and sociologists, especially those concerned with the translocal processes and the world system associated with capitalism, have long been aware that the world has been a congeries of large-scale interactions for many centuries. He begins this essay and he talks about cultural transactions, and two main forces of for sustained cultural interaction before the century have been the warfare and the large-scale political systems sometimes generated by it, and religious sense of conversion. So how the culture got spread to different societies, what were the kind of cultural interactions that used to take place, that he's providing a kind of an introduction. And he says the forces of cultural gravity seems to always pull away from the formations of large-scale ecumens, whether religious, commercial or political, towards small-scale accretions of intimacy and interest, because the culture always tend to act in a very smaller scale, so that you never had much larger political or economic conglomerates earlier. So then he brings in the whole role of colonialism, which was a decisive moment in the human history. So sometimes in the past few centuries, the nature of this gravitational field seems to have changed, partly because of the spirit of the expansion of Western maritime interest after 1500, and partly because of the relatively autonomous developments to a large and aggressive social formations in Americas and Eurasias and other things. So he's talking about how more sustained changes happened in the era of modernity, especially in its combination, in its form as colonial expansion. Then he says that this process was accelerated by the technological transfers and innovations of the late 18th and 19th centuries, the things that we talk about as the Industrial Revolution or Enlightenment period and others, which created complex colonial orders centered in Europe capitals and spread throughout non-European world. This intricate and overlapping set of Euro-colonial worlds, first Spanish and Portuguese, later principally English, French and Dutch, set the basis for a permanent traffic in areas of peoplehood and selfhood, which created imagined communities. And I hope you understand this, you are familiar with this work of Benedict Anderson, on his book titled Imagined Communities. And Imagined Communities is a theorization on nationalism. So Benedict Anderson, in opposition to a whole lot of other theorizations which argued that the question is very simple. How does a nation gets constituted? Okay, how and why people belonging to a particular nation feel the sense of nationalism? What binds the people of a particular nation together? And you know that after this Treaty of Westphalia, and Europe began to see the emergence of nation states, and nation state became the most enduring form of societies. So this whole question emerged: what holds a nation together? And there are competing arguments. For example, there are arguments which say that there is an ethnic basis for a nationalism. Okay? You constitute a nation when you all belong to the same ethnicity. So this primordial identity provides you a sense of belongingness. And in that context, Benedict Anderson puts forward a very important argument about this imagined communities. He argued that modern nation states are nothing but a product of imagined communities. Okay? People are able to imagine that they belong to this particular nation, and this imagination was facilitated by the print capitalism, okay, the emergence of newspapers and other things. With what Benedict Anderson has called the print capitalism, a new power was unleashed in the world. The power of mass literacy and attendant large-scale production of projects of ethnic affinity that were remarkably free of the need to of need for face-to-face communication or of indirect communication between persons and groups. The act of reading things together set the stage for movements based on a paradox, the paradox of constructed primordialism. Okay, so you are able to read and then imagine that you become a part of a community, even though you know that people exist, even though you know that there are you may not know the people face to face, you may not know them directly, but you imagine that you and a person who is sitting, say, 2000 kilometers away or 1500 kilometers away, you belong to the same community. So he mentions that as an important realization. So he also talks about, in the past century there have been a technological explosion largely in the domain of transportation and information that marks the interaction of a print dominant world seems as hard won and as easily erased as the print revolution made easier forms of cultural traffic appear. And talks about Marshall McLuhan, among others, sought to theorize about this world as a global village. But theories such as McLuhan's appear to have overestimated the communitarian implications of the new media order. You can just have a look at these discussions. We are not going into the details because he brings in quite a lot of illustrations, and I don't think that we need to look at each of these examples and illustrations. Let me concentrate more on the key ideas, because these illustrations are from different global backgrounds. They are from different time periods, mostly from early 90s, early 2000, and many of which we may not be familiar with. But he's kind of trying to respond to this larger argument that globalization is nothing but a kind of Americanization. So we discussed that particular argument when we discussed McDonaldization of George Ritzel. So he says that as far as United States is concerned, one might suggest that the issue is no longer one of nostalgia but a social imaginaries built largely around returns. Just read that. It's again a more scenario in the United Nations, how the imperial rise of United Nations had its implications in the cultural field as well, which got expanded into the field of Bollywood films, music, and popular fictions, and a host of other stuff. So he gives quite a lot of illustrations into that. But let me come to more important point. That the crucial point, however, is that the United States is no longer the puppeteer of a world system of images, but it is only one node of a complex transnational construction of imaginary landscape. Okay, so he is very much against this usual argument about Coca-Colaization or Coca-Colonization or McDonaldization or Americanization or the spread of Pan-Americana. He says that it is one of the nodes of complex transnational construction of imaginary landscape. America does not occupy the single most imaginary of the global people. The world we live in today is characterized by a new role for the imagination in social life. To grasp this new role, we need to bring together the old idea of images, especially mechanically produced images. Okay, in Frankfurt School sense, the idea of an imagined community in Anderson's sense, and the French idea of imaginary as a constructed landscape of collective aspirations. Okay, imagination. Here also, Appadurai also brings in this idea of imagination. We will discuss that. It's again not as a kind of a mere fantasy, but as very lethal, very politically productive forms, as a constructed landscape of collective aspirations. So this imagination has the ability to inspire you to act towards a certain thing. Okay. Which is no more and no less real than the collective representation of Emile Durkheim, now mediated through the complex prism of modern media. So the imaged, the image, imagined, the imaginary. These are all terms that direct us to something critical and new in global cultural process. The imagination as a social practice. This is a central theme around which Appadurai builds one of his arguments about cultural globalization. Okay, so the image, whether it is you see in the case of photography or painting or newspaper or other thing, and the imagined, okay, and the imaginary. Okay, these are all terms that direct us to something critical and new in the global cultural processes, the imagination as a social practice. No longer mere fantasy. Okay, so this imagination is no longer mere fantasy, opium for the masses whose real work is elsewhere, no longer simple escape from the world defined principally by more concrete purposes and structures, no longer elite pastime, okay, and no longer mere contemplation. The imagination has become an organized field of social practices, and he elaborates that as a form of work and as a form of negotiation between sites of agency, individuals, and globally defined fields of possibility. So he brings this notion of imagination to the central stage, and that is why he re-emphasizes this whole importance of culture. The culture is not only as your values or your ideas as we discussed in the conventional anthropology, but how this cultural imagination, culture plays a very important role in this new form of social practice, what he calls it as social imagination. Yeah, so he comes back to this whole question of Americanization, about global homogeneity and cultural homogenization. We discussed, George Ritz's argument that there is a major homogenization taking place. There is a, this rationality taking over everything. There is a uniformity coming into even to our food, our dance, our music, our leisure, everything. But Appadurai is extremely critical of that. So he says that what these arguments fail to consider is that at least as rapidly as forces from various metropolis are brought into new societies, they tend to become indigenized in one way or the other. This is an extremely important point. Something similar to what we discussed as globalization. Okay, not globalization but globalization. Okay, so as when things become as forces from various metropolis are brought into new societies, they tend to become indigenized. Okay, they tend to become a part of the local. They tend to get adapted, or they're forced to adapt to the kind of a local scenario, changing their character, content, and even intent. So he gives quite a lot of examples. This is true of musics and housing styles as much as true of science and terrorism, spectacles, and constitutions. And he also says that this whole idea about Americanization is a kind of a far-fetched one, but if you look into very specific geographies, okay, the source of influence could be very different. He says that it is worth noticing that for people of Irian Jaya, Indonization may be the more worrisome than Americanization, as Japanization may be for Koreans, Indianization for Sri Lankans, and maybe even for Nepalese, Vietnamization for the Cambodians, and Russianization for the people of Soviet Armenia and Baltic republics. So these are some of the important and immediate sources of influence, rather than an America sitting and then influencing everywhere in a uniform manner. You need to look into the kind of a geographical distinctiveness. So the central point that he argues is that the new global cultural economy has to be seen as a complex, overlapping, disjunctive order that cannot any longer be understood in terms of existing center-periphery model. Okay, because the center-periphery model was a neo-Marxian argument put forward by, say, theorists of dependency theory and then later world system theories, saying that there is a core, there is a periphery, and there is a semi-periphery in between. And so they argued that maybe from 1500 onwards, for the last 500 years, how this whole world has been an integrated one. Okay, and that particular argument, Appadurai says that is insufficient to make sense of the contemporary scenario. Nor is susceptible to simple models of push and pull in terms of migration theory, or surplus and deficits as in traditional modes of balanced trade, or of consumers and producers as in the neo-Marxist theories of development. Even in the most complex and flexible theories of global development that have come out of the Marxist tradition. Okay, so then he introduces So he, I hope you understood the manner in which he enters into his own argument. So he provides a very interesting introduction about the contemporary scenario and how these existing theorizations hardly help us to make sense of that. It's not an Americanization. You need to look into different geographic area. Then you will see that in given geographies there are important source of inspiration, important source of cultural diffusion, and then he almost kind of argues that the existing frameworks do not help. So then he comes to his fundamental framework, okay, his most important framework, which he says that I propose that an elementary framework for exploring such disjunctures is to look at the relationship among 5 dimensions of global cultural flows that can be termed as ethnoscape, mediascape, technoscape, financescape, and ideascape. Okay, the suffix scape allows us to point to the fluid, irregular shapes of these landscapes, shapes that characterize international capacity as deeply as they do international clothing styles. Okay, so he I think maybe it's time. We can take a pause now. We can kind of wind up the class now, and then begin with the subsequent section in the coming class, because he's beginning his major theorization from this particular part onwards, and I don't want to take away too much of the time, so that we will be kind of left in between. So let me stop here with his argument that he's introducing this 5 scape. Okay, and we will begin the next class by trying to understand why is that he using, what does it mean to be each of these scape, why is that he using this term scape as a suffix. Okay, what are its explanatory potentials, and what is his overall theorization. Okay, and here you see that he comes up with his own original theorization. He's not simply describing certain things, he's not simply providing certain kind of detail, he's coming up with very interesting, fascinating original theorization. Okay, and that is what is more interesting. So he talks about 5 interrelationship among 5 dimensions of global cultural flows, that is ethnoscape, mediascape, technoscape, financescape, and ideascape. And we will continue with the rest of this essay in the coming class. Okay, thank you.